They're not worth the food they eat, but the law says we gotta take something. The auctioneer sneered, his thin voice cutting through the cold October air. 3 fat widows, gentlemen, useless for marriage but strong enough for work. Who'll start the bidding? The courthouse steps in Silver Creek, Montana Territory were packed that morning in October 1885. Men in worn coats and women in shawls pressed close, breath steaming in the chill. Debt settlement day always drew a crowd. Some came to bid on cheap labor. Others came for the spectacle of their neighbor's shame. On the rough plank platform stood 3 women, side by side like cattle brought to market. Martha Hennessy, 38, tall and broad-shouldered, her black dress pulled tight across her 320-pound frame. Her dark hair was streaked with early gray, her jaw set in a line that said she'd die before she'd let them see her cry. Clara Burke, 35, shorter, softer, nearly 300 pounds, hands twisting in front of her as she tried to keep from shaking. Her round face was pale, but her eyes, faintly hazel, kept flicking toward the crowd, searching for anyone who might speak for her. No one did. Ida Thompson, 41, the heaviest of the 3 at close to 340 pounds, with a wide, capable body that had birthed and buried 2 children and worked through more winters than she cared to count. She stood very still, as if the only power she had left was refusing to flinch. 6 months earlier, they'd all been wives of miners at the Silver Creek No. 2 shaft. One bad morning, the earth had buckled, timbers snapped, and a wall of rock had come down like God's own judgment. 24 men never walked out of that hole, including Ben Hennessy, Thomas Burke, and James Thompson. The company sent flowers and a priest. The company store sent bills. When the women couldn't pay their dead husbands' debts, the law had a solution: 5 years of compulsory labor to whoever bought their contracts. Food, lodging, clothing in exchange for their freedom. On paper, it was indenture. In reality, everyone knew it was legalized slavery. Lot 17, called the auctioneer, Whitmore, a narrow-faced man who smiled too easily at other people's misery. 3 widows, packaged deal: Martha, Clara, and Ida. Combined debt, $600. We'll start the bidding at $200. Who'll take these big girls off the town's hands? Laughter rippled through the crowd. $200, shouted a mine foreman, known for working men until their backs broke. $250, called a rancher whose last batch of debt workers had run off and never been seen again. Martha tightened her grip on Clara's hand. Ida stared straight ahead at nothing at all, lips moving in a silent prayer. The bids climbed, each shout another nail in the coffin of their freedom. $300, yelled someone near the back. $325. $350. Whitmore's smile stretched wider. $350. Do I hear 4? A deep voice rolled over the crowd like distant thunder. Stop! I'll buy those 3 fat widows. $600 cash on the barrelhead, and I'm taking them home today. The crowd parted, people shifting aside almost without thinking, and turned to see who had spoken. Nathaniel Blackwood was already stepping forward. Nathaniel Blackwood did not hurry. He never had. A man who'd spent 25 years in the Montana high country had no need to prove himself with speed. He moved like a grizzly in winter, slow, deliberate, unstoppable once he chose a direction. He stood head and shoulders above the crowd, 6'11" in worn buckskins, a coat of winter-thick beard, and dark hair threaded with silver. His boots were muddy from the trail. His expression was the same as always, unreadable, quiet. but carrying a gravity that made men step aside without needing to be asked. Whitmore sputtered when Nate reached the steps. Mr. Blackwood, sir, the bidding is only at $350. You don't need to offer—" "I said 600, Nate answered, voice low but carrying across the crowd. "That's their debt, isn't it? Paid in full, which means they walk away free. Today." A ripple of shock passed through the onlookers. "Free?" someone muttered. "Nobody does that." "He's crazy. 600 for 3 fat widows. They ain't worth half that." Nate didn't spare the crowd a look. His gaze remained fixed on Whitmore, steady as a rifle barrel. "Take my money," he repeated, "and give me their papers." Whitmore adjusted his collar, suddenly nervous. "Well, yes, that is the law. But, Mr. Blackwood, surely you realize these women, given their size, will be expensive to feed, hard to manage. And they're widows. You know how that goes. Folks say widows come with moods, difficulties, attachments." Nate stepped forward, and Whitmore shut his mouth with an audible click. "It'll cost me nothing compared to what they already paid," Nate said. "Now stop wasting time." He pulled a leather pouch from his coat, heavy enough that the clinking of coins drew gasps from the crowd. Gold, actual gold, enough to buy 30 acres of good grazing land, enough to stake a man for life, enough to buy freedom 3 times over. Whitmore counted the money with trembling fingers, wrote 3 release contracts, and stamped them with the territorial seal. "It's done," the auctioneer said faintly. "They're yours, Mr. Blackwood." "Not mine," Nate corrected. "Just free." He turned then, finally facing the women. Up close, he looked even larger. Martha, proud even in fear, drew herself to full height, chin lifting in defiance. Clara pressed a shaking hand to her heart. Ida blinked hard, fighting tears she had sworn she wouldn't shed in public. Nate's voice softened a fraction. "Ladies, my wagon's around back. We're leaving now." Martha found her voice first, though it trembled. "Mr. Blackwood, sir, please tell us what you expect of us. We can work hard. We can clean, cook, sew, tend gardens, whatever is needed. But we need to understand our position. Are we servants?" "No," Nate said. "Indentured laborers?" Ida asked softly. "No." "Then what?" Clara whispered. "Are we to you?" Nate took a breath that seemed to draw in the entire morning chill. "6 months ago," he began, "your husband saved my life." All 3 women froze. "I was caught in an early snowstorm up in Copper Ridge, lost my way, nearly froze. I stumbled into your mining camp half dead. Your men, Ben, Thomas, James, they took me in, fed me, shared their blankets, sat up half the night warming my hands so I wouldn't lose fingers to frostbite." Martha pressed a hand over her mouth. Clara began to tremble again, but this time for a different reason. Ida finally let one tear slip. "You 3 cooked for me," Nate continued, "mended my coat, treated me like a man, not a wild animal out of the hills. I told your husbands that if they ever needed anything at all, they had only to send word." He paused. "No word came. Then I heard about the collapse." Clara's legs wobbled. Nate steadied her with one huge hand, not touching, simply close enough that she could lean if she needed to. "I came to the funeral," Nate said, "stood in the back, didn't know what to say, didn't know if it would help to say anything. Then last week, I heard the company store was pushing you into auction. That's when I knew how to pay my debt." "You owed us nothing," Martha whispered. "No, I owed your husbands everything." Nate gestured toward the street. So here's the truth. I bought your contracts to free you, not to own you, not to keep you, to give you a choice. What choice? Ida asked. I live 40 miles north in a cabin big enough for a family. You're welcome to stay the winter. No debt, no servitude, just shelter and safety. You help around the place if you want to contribute, but you owe me nothing. Come spring, I'll stake you for wherever you want to go next. Back east, another town, anywhere. Clara's voice was barely audible. Why would you do all that? For us? Nate looked at them steadily, and for the first time, something like grief flickered in his eyes. Because your husbands didn't survive the mountain that killed them, but I did, and a man doesn't forget the ones who saved him. Silence settled, heavy and trembling. Finally, Martha whispered, Mr. Blackwood, Nate, yes, we'll go with you. Clara nodded. Ida took Martha's hand. Nate inclined his head once. Good. Let's get you home. The wagon creaked under the combined weight of the three women, their meager belongings, and the thick supplies Nate had purchased before leaving town. Flour, beans, dried meat, wool blankets, tools. Everything a person needed to survive a Montana winter, provided they had the will for it. Nate didn't speak much as he drove. He handled the reins with the same calm certainty he carried in his stride. The horses trusted him. The land seemed to recognize him. Even the wind quieted each time he paused to listen. Behind him, the three widows sat bundled in borrowed coats, absorbing the reality of what had just happened. Ida broke the silence first. I still don't understand, she murmured. $600? That's more money than most men ever see. More than any of our husbands ever earned, Clara whispered. Why would he spend that on us? Martha looked ahead at Nate's broad shoulders, his sure hands on the reins. Because he meant what he said, she answered softly. Ben trusted him, said he was a rare sort, one of the few mountain men who kept his word in every season. Clara exhaled. 6 months ago, we were making stew and coffee for him in the camp kitchen, and now, Martha finished, he's trying to pay back a debt no one else would have considered real. The trail grew narrower as they left Silver Creek behind. Pines closed in around them, heavy with early frost. The mountains rose like great granite guardians on either side of the valley. After an hour, Nate finally spoke without turning around. It'll take 2 days to reach the cabin. We'll stop at the halfway shelter tonight. Clara blinked. You have a shelter? Built it years ago, Nate said. Winters are long up here. Man needs places to get out of the cold. Ida smiled faintly. Sounds like you've helped a lot of people over the years. No, Nate said. Not enough. His tone ended the subject. Mid-afternoon, the wagon hit a rough patch. Nate slowed the horses and glanced over his shoulder. We'll stop here. Time to stretch your legs. Martha helped Clara and Ida down. The air was sharp and clean, smelling of pine sap and riverstone. The women moved stiffly at first. Auction blocks were not built for comfort and shivered against the mountain chill. Nate came around the wagon with a blanket in his hands. Without preamble, he draped it across Clara's shoulders. She startled. Oh, I didn't. Thank you. You're cold, Nate said simply. He moved on, handing another blanket to Martha, then Ida, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. Martha noticed something then. He did not look at their bodies the way men usually did. Not with judgment, not with amusement, not with that cruel, knowing gaze that weighed women like livestock. He looked at them the way a man looks at travelers he's responsible for, capable, practical, without vanity. It unsettled her more than cruelty would have. "Mr. Blackwood," she said, "you're treating us like guests, but we know what we are, women past our prime, heavy, in debt." Nate met her eyes with steady calm. "You're women who survived what would have killed most. You're strong, and you're owed better than what this world's given you." Martha swallowed. "We're not used to kindness is all." "I can tell," Nate answered, "but you'll get used to it." As twilight fell, they reached a clearing with a small, sturdy log structure tucked between two pines. Smoke curled from a stone chimney. Clara's brow furrowed. "Someone's here?" "No," Nate said. "I keep a fire ready during travel months, in case I'm caught out or someone else needs shelter." He helped them down, unloaded supplies, and pushed open the door. Heat spilled out. Gentle, welcome, alive. Inside was simple but clean. A long table, bunks built into the wall, a stone fireplace wide enough to roast an elk haunch. Fresh firewood had been stacked inside. Someone, Nate himself presumably, had been by recently to keep the place ready. The widows stepped in hesitantly, as if expecting a trap. Instead, they saw blankets, lantern oil, dried herbs hanging from the rafters. Ida touched a quilt folded on the bunk. "You prepared all this in case strangers needed it." "Strangers or myself," Nate said. "Winter ain't merciful, so I try to be." The simplicity of it struck Martha in the chest. Over supper, beans and salted pork heated in a black iron pot, the women began to unfurl like flowers in cautious sunlight. Clara was the first to speak. "We didn't just lose our husbands in the collapse. We lost our income, our reputations, everything the town valued." Nate nodded, without interrupting. "People avoided us," she continued, "said we ate too much, said fat widows were burdens on society." Martha huffed. "They said worse than that. Called us curses, said the mine collapsed because God was punishing us." "They're wrong," Nate said simply. "You don't even know us," Ida whispered. "I know loss," he answered. "I know grief. I know what it is to be blamed for things that weren't your fault." Clara watched him carefully. "You speak like a man who's lost more than a wife." Nate's jaw tightened. "I lost too," he said quietly. "A wife and an infant son. Cholera took them before I could get help. That's why I built the cabin big, why I keep shelters stocked, why I don't let folks freeze or starve if I can prevent it." Martha's breath caught. "You built a life meant for a family, then lived in it alone." "For 25 years, Nate said. Silence held the room like a delicate thread. Finally he said, "Eat. Rest. Tomorrow's a harder climb." But the women exchanged glances. Something had shifted. They were no longer three widows following a stranger into the unknown. They were three women beginning to feel, against every instinct, the dangerous whisper of trust. By mid-morning the next day, the trail narrowed into a winding ascent cut through dense pines, where snow lingered in shaded pockets despite the late autumn sun. The horses strained, their breaths steaming in the crisp air. The widows clung to the wagon's rails, marveling at sights they'd never imagined, cliffs carved by centuries of wind, peaks crowned in early white, valleys glowing gold with dying aspens. When they reached the summit ridge, the land opened like a curtain drawn back. "There," Nate said, pointing with his chin. Below them lay a homestead more substantial than any of the women expected. A wide cabin of peeled logs stood sturdy among the pines, smoke curling from a stone chimney. A barn sat to the right, fenced pasture to the left. Behind the house stretched a lake so still it mirrored the mountains rising beyond it. Clara clapped a hand over her mouth. Ida gripped Martha's arm. Martha simply whispered, "My word." Nate guided the wagon down the final stretch, stopping in the packed dirt yard in front of the cabin. "Welcome home," he said. The words struck all three women at once. Home, after months of grief, humiliation, hunger, and fear. Someone had said the word as though it rightly belonged to them. Inside, the cabin was warm, truly warm, not the thin heat of a miner's shack. A fire roared in a wide stone hearth. Heavy rugs softened the floor. A long table of polished pine stretched near the center of the room, flanked by mismatched but sturdy chairs. On the far wall stood shelves hewn from logs and filled with jars, preserves, herbs, dried berries. But what astonished the widows most were the bedrooms, 4 of them, as promised. Martha's room held a wide bed, handmade quilt, and a window overlooking the lake. The sight of the quilt alone brought tears to her eyes. No one had given her anything soft in months. Clara's room had a small rocking chair by the window. Ida's room had shelves built into the wall and hooks for drying herbs. They explored in silence, each woman touching small things, curtains, blankets, water pitchers, as if afraid they might vanish. Nate stood in the main room, arms folded. "Martha gets the lake room," he said. "Clara the rocking chair room. Ida the shelves. You can switch if you prefer." "No," Martha murmured. It's perfect." Nate nodded, as if that settled it. He spent the afternoon bringing in supplies while the widows took quiet stock of their new reality. Clara found the courage to ask, "Where will you sleep, Mr. Blackwood?" "Here," Nate said, patting the ground by the fire. "I've slept by hearths more years than not. Suits me fine." Ida frowned. "But that isn't proper." Nate shrugged. "You're my guests. You get the rooms." The first few days passed gently. Clara insisted on cooking. Martha swept and washed linens. Ida took stock of the food stores and began planning winter meals. Nate split wood, repaired a latch on the barn, hauled water, and vanished into the woods for hours at a time before returning with game or fish. He did not hover. He did not demand. He simply existed among them like a great silent guardian of the mountains. But in the evenings, when lamps were lit and dinner was finished, something shifted. The widows had expected awkward silence. Instead, Nate surprised them. He talked. Not much, but just enough. He told stories of storms survived, bears avoided, and a moose that chased him 3 miles because he'd gotten between her and her calf. He played a battered fiddle in slow, low tunes that made Clara close her eyes and sway gently. He carved small toys, birds, a fox, a deer, and left them on the table without explanation. The women warmed to him, not because they felt indebted, not because he demanded affection, but because, in the stillness of winter nights, Nate Blackwood spoke like a man who'd forgotten how to share himself, and was remembering how, bit by bit. Martha was the first to notice. He moved quietly around them, deliberately keeping distance, never touching, never invading space. But he watched them with a carefulness that was almost protective. When Clara coughed one evening, he was there with hot water and honey. When Ida slipped on ice outside the barn, he caught her elbow before she hit the ground, then stepped back as though worried the contact offended her. When Martha struggled with a heavy pot, he lifted it with one hand and said nothing but, "Careful, cast iron bites." He treated them neither as burdens nor curiosities. He treated them as valuable. The widows began to settle into themselves again. Ida started humming while she cooked. Clara began brushing her hair again each morning. Martha found herself smiling at small things: sunlight on the lake, the smell of fresh bread, things she thought she'd lost forever. One crisp afternoon, they sat on the porch while Nate chopped wood nearby. Clara said softly, "I feel safe." Ida nodded. "I'd forgotten what that feels like." Martha looked at Nate's silhouette, a towering figure against the bright sky, splitting logs with steady rhythm, and whispered, "A man like that doesn't happen twice in a lifetime." Clara exhaled. "I think he's lonely." "No," Ida murmured, "not lonely, just waiting for something or someone." Martha's heart tightened unexpectedly. That evening, after supper, Clara finally asked the question they'd all held back. "Nate, why did you build a cabin with 4 bedrooms?" He stopped cleaning his rifle and stared into the fire. "I built it when I was 24, he said. "My wife was expecting. I thought we'd fill it." Martha's breath caught. "What happened?" Ida asked gently. "She died before the thaw," Nate said. "Our baby with her. I couldn't bring myself to leave the cabin, couldn't bring myself to stay in it either. For a long while it was just a house with empty rooms." Clara touched her heart. "Nate, we're sorry." He shook his head once. "No need. Life takes. Life gives. When your husband saved me years later, I figured maybe it was time to use the space for someone again." Silence settled warm as a blanket. The fire popped. Snow drifted outside the windows. And for the first time since the mine collapse took everything from them, the widows felt not like burdens or charity cases, but like women who had a place in the world again, a place with a man who valued them, a place that could become more. The thaw came late that spring, softening the earth, but not the tension that had begun quietly winding through the valley. The widows had settled into life with Nate so naturally that it startled them sometimes. How easily morning chores, shared meals, and long winter evenings had grown into comfort rather than obligation. But comfort had a way of coaxing old wounds to the surface, and Silver Creek, hungry, suspicious, always whispering, had begun noticing their absence. One afternoon, Clara came in from gathering kindling with her face pale. "Nate," she said quietly, "there were men down by the river road. They were talking about us." Nate looked up sharply. "What men?" "Company men," Clara replied, "from the mine. They were saying we'd run off to avoid paying our husbands' debts, saying women who looked like us wouldn't last long with a mountain man who bought them outright." Martha flinched. Ida's jaw tightened. Nate rose from his chair slowly. His height filled the room like approaching thunder. "They came onto my land?" "Close enough," Clara whispered. Nate's eyes hardened. "I'll deal with 'em." But before he could step outside, Ida grabbed his arm. "Nate, there's more." Her voice trembled in a way Nate had never heard. "The company store hired a collector, said they'll challenge the legitimacy of the auction if they think they can squeeze more money out of us. They're saying the sale wasn't final, that they might come claim us again." Martha felt the room tilt. The thought of being dragged back onto another auction block made her stomach clench with old humiliation. Nate's expression turned dark. No one will take you from here, not while I'm breathing. But the trouble wasn't only coming from Silver Creek. That night, Martha woke to the sound of Nate pacing the main room. She stood in the doorway of her bedroom and watched him, a great man bowed under something heavier than any log he'd ever carried. "Nate," she said softly. He stopped, but didn't turn. "Go back to sleep. Talk to me." He exhaled slowly, as though letting out a breath he'd held for years. "There's something I ain't told you, ladies." Martha's heart tightened. "About the company store?" "No." He turned then, and the firelight caught the grief carved into his face. "About your husbands." Martha's breath caught. "Our husbands?" "I didn't just stumble into their camp that night," Nate said. "I was escaping something. Men." "What men?" Ida whispered. "Railroad men," Nate replied. "They wanted a section of land up north, land I refused to sell. I'd lived there 20 years, buried my wife and son there. Wasn't going to give it up for tracts and profit." Clara's eyes widened. "So they came after you?" "They tried." Nate rubbed a hand over his beard. "Beat me near dead, took everything I had. I crawled through 2 miles of snow looking for shelter." He swallowed. "Your husbands found me, took me into their tent, hid me when the men came looking." Martha pressed a hand to her mouth. "They risked everything," Nate said, voice rough. "If the railroad men had found me there, they'd have blamed your husbands, your whole camp. Might have burned it to the ground." Ida shook her head. "But they didn't tell us." "They wouldn't," Nate said. "Good men don't boast about saving lives. But I've lived with the guilt for years. They protected me. I didn't protect them." "Don't say that," Martha said fiercely. "The mine collapse wasn't your fault." "Maybe not," Nate said quietly. "But I owed them. And when I saw you 3 on that auction block, alone, terrified, carrying debts that weren't yours, I knew I wouldn't fail their families twice." Silence rippled through the room like a held breath. Martha stepped closer. "Nate, thank you for telling us." But Nate's expression didn't soften. "There's more. The railroad men, they're back in the territory. I saw smoke on the North Ridge last week, campfires where there shouldn't be any." Clara's voice trembled. "Are they looking for you?" "Maybe," Nate said. "Maybe they want the land again. Or maybe they're just passing through. But if they come here expecting the same scared man they beat years ago," his expression was stone, "they'll find something else." Silver Creek's problems reached them first. 3 days later, a wagon approached the homestead. 3 company men sat atop it, greasy hats, stern faces, hands hovering near holstered firearms. Martha stood at the window. "Nate, they're here." Clara and Ida instinctively moved closer to her, forming the same protective arc they'd formed on the auction block. Nate didn't reach for a gun. He simply stepped onto the porch. The men dismounted. "Blackwood," the leader said, "we're here for the widows." "You're trespassing." Nate's voice was low, steady. "Turn around." The man smirked. "They were sold improperly. We're collecting them on behalf of the company. They still owe labor." "They owe nothing," Nate replied. "Their debts were paid in full." "Not according to our books," the man snapped, "and not according to the new territorial guidelines. They belong to us." Martha felt fury rise in her chest, fury she hadn't allowed herself in months. Ida gripped her arm tightly. Clara's lips trembled. Nate's eyes darkened. "They belong to no one." The man reached for his revolver. Martha gasped. Nate didn't flinch. You're drawing a gun on a man on his own land, in front of 3 witnesses. You sure that's the story you want following you to the territorial courts? The man froze. Nate stepped forward. Now listen close. These women are under my protection. They're free. Their contracts are void. And if you lay one more claim on them, you won't make it back to Silver Creek to tell the tale. His voice never rose. It didn't need to. The men backed toward their wagon, uncertain whether retreat was dignity or survival. When they finally fled down the trail, the widows sagged against each other. "Nate," Clara whispered, "you could have been killed." "So could they," Nate said. He turned toward them, expression softening into something raw, vulnerable. "I won't let anyone take you, not the company, not the railroad, not anyone. You're safe here." He meant it, and that, more than anything, terrified and comforted them in equal measure, because safety was something they'd never had before. The company men didn't return the next day or the day after. But tension coiled around the homestead like barbed wire, invisible yet impossible to ignore. Martha felt it in the way Nate checked the windows before blowing out the lamps each night. Clara felt it in the way the horses grew restless, alert to scents traveling on the wind. Ida felt it in her bones, the same way she'd felt the earth shift the morning the mine collapsed. On the 5th evening, as the sun bled red across the ridge, Nate stepped onto the porch and stilled. Smoke curled upward from the southern tree line, not the thin gray of a campfire, the thick, oily black of signal smoke. "They're coming," Nate said quietly. The widows gathered behind him. "How many?" Martha whispered. "Don't know," Nate said. "But it ain't just the company men. That's railroad signaling. They want me to know they're close." Ida stepped forward. "Nate, you helped us face our fear. Let us stand with you." His jaw clenched. "I won't put you 3 in danger." "You didn't put us in danger," Clara said, voice trembling but brave. "The world did, and we're tired of running from it." Nate looked at them, really looked, and something shifted in his eyes. Recognition, respect, gratitude. "All right," he said, "but stay behind me." They didn't have long to wait. Minutes later, 6 riders emerged from the woods, company men flanking 2 railroad enforcers. The lead rider dismounted, a tall man in a black coat with a silver watch chain glinting at his vest. "Blackwood," he called, his voice smug and sharp. "You've been avoiding us." Nate stepped off the porch. "Didn't know we had business." "Oh, we do," the man said, smiling thinly. "You're squatting on railroad-claimed land, and you're harboring women who belong to the Silver Creek Company store." "They don't belong to anyone," Nate said. "Their debts were paid." "Not according to the new assessment," the man replied. "Debts accrue interest, and since they ran from the company's lawful custody, the penalty has doubled. They're ours." Clara gasped. Ida squeezed her hand. Martha stepped closer to Nate without realizing it. "No," Nate said simply. The man sighed, as though dealing with a stubborn child. "I was hoping you'd cooperate. You see, Blackwood, the railroad needs this valley, and you're an inconvenience. Your deeds aren't recognized by territorial surveyors. Your refusal to sell marks you as a squatter, and harboring fugitives, watch your words," Nate warned, "makes you criminally liable." The company men shifted their hands toward their guns. The widows tensed. The man smiled. "Hand the women over, sign over the land, and we'll let you leave alive." Nate's voice was steady as bedrock. This land holds my wife's grave, my son's grave. You think you can scare me off it?" "We can kill you," the man said. "Easier than scaring you, it seems." Nate didn't reach for his gun. He didn't need to. He stepped forward, towering, calm as falling snow, and said, "Then you'd best start shooting, because nothing on this earth will make me hand these women to animals like you." The man's smile faded. "Fine," he snapped. "Men—" Before he could finish the order, Martha stepped forward. "Nate Blackwood stands with us," she said, her voice ringing across the clearing. "We stand with him." Clara lifted her chin. "We will not be sold again." Ida's gaze was steady as steel. "Try to take us, and you'll answer to all four of us." For a moment the riders hesitated, because this was no longer one man against a company. It was a family, unconventional, unbroken, unafraid. The man spat. "This isn't over." "Oh, it is," Nate said quietly. "You'll ride away now, and if you come back, you'd better bring coffins." Something in his voice, final, cold, certain, made even the enforcers stiffen. The riders withdrew, slowly, silently. And when the last hoofbeat faded into the trees, Martha exhaled shakily. "Nate," she whispered, "what happens now?" "Now," Nate said, eyes still fixed on the shadows where the riders vanished, "we prepare for what comes next." But when he finally turned toward the widows, something softer flickered beneath his rugged exterior. "Whatever happens," he said, "you're safe here." And for the first time since they'd stood on an auction block, the women believed him. The next morning dawned quiet, too quiet, the kind of stillness that made a person wonder if danger had passed or was only gathering strength behind the ridgeline. Frost shimmered across the meadow. Smoke rose steady from the cabin chimney. Nothing moved, but the widows felt it, the shift. Something had changed forever. Inside, Nate was checking the rifles, oiling the bolts with calm, methodical motions, not frantic, not afraid, prepared. A man who understood storms, weather and human alike, and knew when one had only paused, not ended. Martha entered the room, her shawl wrapped tight around her broad shoulders. "You didn't sleep." "Didn't need to," Nate replied without looking up. "I'll rest tonight." She knew he was lying. Clara and Ida came in next, carrying the morning bread they'd baked out of instinct more than appetite. For months, the kitchen had been full of warmth and noise, the smells of biscuits and stew and wood smoke. This morning, the air carried a fragile hush, like everything was listening. "Nate," Ida said, setting the loaf down, "we need to talk about yesterday." He paused. "All right." Clara cleared her throat. "What happens now, after the standoff? Will they return?" "Eventually," Nate said. "Maybe not today, maybe not this week. But men who want land or control, they don't give up easy." Martha stepped closer. "And what will you do when they come?" Nate finally met their eyes. He looked at each of them slowly, deliberately. Martha, with her quiet strength, Clara, with her gentle heart, Ida, with her unshakable steadiness. "I'll do what I promised," he said simply. "Protect you. Protect this home. Whatever comes, I won't let them take you." Clara's eyes filled with tears. "You can't stand against the whole railroad." Nate set the rifle aside as if putting down a burden older than grief. "Not alone." Then he added, voice softer, "But I'm not alone anymore." The room stilled. The widows felt the truth of that settle across the floorboards, across their hearts. For the first time in 5 long years, first as wives, then as widows, Then, as auctioned property, they were no longer facing life alone. They were facing it together. Martha stepped forward, her hand trembling only slightly as she laid it on Nate's arm. "Then we'll stand with you." Ida nodded. "Whatever comes," Clara added, voice steadying. "This is our home now, too." Nate swallowed once, throat tightening. A big man made small by emotion he didn't yet have words for. Outside, the wind rustled through the pines, a low, steady whisper, not a warning, but a reminder of the world waiting beyond their little valley. "Come," Martha said gently. "Sit with us a while. No rifles, no worry, just sit." Nate hesitated. Then he followed them to the hearth, eased himself into the chair that had always seemed too large for one man. The widows gathered near, knitting, kneading dough, mending a shirt. Ordinary tasks, quiet domesticity, the kind of life none of them ever thought they'd have again. He watched them for a long moment, watched Martha's steady hands, watched Clara humming as she worked, watched Ida's soft patience, and in the flicker of firelight something settled in his expression, something like peace trying to crawl its way back into a man who'd forgotten the shape of it. "You're safe here," Nate murmured, not as a declaration this time, but as a vow. The widows looked at him, their eyes warm, grateful, and finally hopeful. Outside, the snow melted slowly into spring. Inside, a family, unconventional, unpolished, unexpected, took root. But the question lingered softly in the air, like smoke drifting toward an open sky. Would the love they were building be strong enough to face the world waiting beyond the tree line? Stories like this one don't grow from comfort. They grow from struggle, from people who've been bruised by the world, yet still reach for something better. Nate and the three widows remind us that family isn't always who you're born to. Sometimes it's who stands beside you when everyone else turns away. Thank you for traveling to this quiet Montana valley with me, for listening to a tale built from loss, courage, and unexpected belonging. Before you go, tell me, where in the world are you hearing this story tonight? If you still believe love can take unusual shapes and still be real, don't wander far. The next frontier story is already waiting.